You probably think you know exactly what happened on the moon on July 20th, 1969. The Eagle landed. Neil Armstrong stepped outside. The flag went up. President Nixon called the astronauts. Simple. But Apollo 11 didn't leave behind one perfect timeline. It left behind mission reports, transcripts, telemetry, recordings, photographs, and broadcast footage. And when you put those records side by side, the story becomes a lot more complicated. For decades, most of us experienced Apollo 11 through one familiar version of the story, the television broadcast. But television wasn't the mission itself. Behind that broadcast were hundreds of technical systems recording information in completely different ways. Mission Control had its own records. The spacecraft had its own data. The astronauts' communications were recorded, and television stations were recording the signal independently. So what happens when you compare them? That's where Apollo 11 gets genuinely fascinating. Let's start with something that sounds obvious. There isn't a single document called the Apollo 11 timeline. NASA produced mission reports and detailed chronological records. The astronauts' communications were preserved in transcripts. Telemetry recorded spacecraft systems and measurements. And the television broadcast created another record of what the public actually saw. These records were created for different purposes. And that matters. A mission report summarizes events. A transcript records communications. Telemetry records technical information, and broadcast footage records what reached television audiences. They're not supposed to be identical. And suddenly, comparing Apollo 11 becomes less like reading a timeline, and more like reconstructing one. Now take the most important event of the mission, the landing. On July 20th, 1969, the lunar module Eagle touched down on the moon in the Sea of Tranquility. Mission Control was following the descent through spacecraft communications and telemetry. The astronauts were reporting what they could see and what the spacecraft was doing. And millions of people on Earth were listening. But here's something important. The famous television broadcast wasn't showing every piece of information Mission Control had. The audience heard selected communications. They saw the television signal. Meanwhile, controllers had access to technical information coming from the spacecraft. So when someone asks, what exactly happened at the moment of landing? The answer depends on which record you're examining. And that isn't evidence of a cover-up. It's evidence that Apollo was being recorded from multiple perspectives. Then there's one of the most famous conversations in human history. President Richard Nixon called Armstrong and Aldrin while they were on the lunar surface. You've probably seen the footage. But the important question isn't whether the call happened. It did. The interesting part is where it fits in the mission timeline. The astronauts had already landed. Armstrong had already stepped onto the lunar surface. The lunar television camera was transmitting, and the president's call became part of that historic sequence. So rather than looking for an impossible overlap, we can use the call as a reference point. Landing. First steps. Surface operations. Presidential call. Each event can be placed against the mission's recorded chronology. And when you do that carefully, something becomes clear. The Apollo timeline isn't mysterious because the events were secretly rearranged. It's mysterious because the amount of surviving information is enormous. Now we get to the part that sounds like science fiction. Telemetry. While Armstrong and Aldrin were flying the lunar module, hundreds of measurements were being transmitted. Altitude, velocity, engine parameters, spacecraft systems, environmental measurements, and much more. This data wasn't created to make a documentary. It existed because Mission Control needed to know what the spacecraft was doing. That's why telemetry is so valuable today. It gives historians something different from a transcript. A transcript tells us what someone said. Telemetry can tell us what the spacecraft was reporting. And when historians reconstruct Apollo missions, they don't rely on one source. They compare them. Communication, telemetry, mission documentation, photographs, film, broadcast recordings. It's essentially a giant historical cross-check. And then we reach one of the strangest parts of the Apollo 11 story. The original slow-skin television recordings of the moonwalk were not preserved. NASA's investigation concluded that the original telemetry format tapes were likely reused or erased as part of a tape management process. That sounds unbelievable today. But in 1969, magnetic tape was expensive. The idea that historical footage would one day become priceless wasn't exactly obvious to everyone. Fortunately, the broadcast wasn't recorded in only one place. Stations and facilities on Earth had captured copies of the signal. One important source was Australia's receiving network. Parkes and the Honeysuckle Creek facilities played major roles in receiving the Apollo television signal. And in 2009, NASA released a restored version assembled from surviving recordings. Think about what that means. The original source recording was gone, but copies of the same historic transmission had survived elsewhere. So researchers weren't simply watching the original tape. They were reconstructing the broadcast from surviving generations of recordings. And this is where the story gets interesting. When you watch Apollo 11 today, you're not looking through one window into 1969. You're looking through layers of history. The mission produced technical records. The astronauts produced communications. Ground stations received signals. Television networks recorded broadcasts. And historians later assembled those surviving pieces into coherent records. Some original material is gone. Some material survives in copies. Some records are technical. Others are summaries. And that's why small differences between sources don't automatically mean someone changed history. Sometimes they're simply different records of the same event. The real question isn't, what did NASA hide? The better question is, how much of Apollo 11 can we reconstruct from the evidence that survived? And the answer is a remarkable amount, but not everything. I've put the primary sources and restored Apollo 11 material in the description. You can examine the mission records, transcripts, and surviving footage yourself. Because with something this important, you shouldn't have to take my word for it. Look at the evidence, compare the records, and decide what the history actually tells us. If you want part 2, comment, Archives. Apollo May 11th be one of the most documented missions in human history. But sometimes, the most interesting stories aren't hidden in what survived. They're hidden in what didn't.